Welcome to the deep dive. If you're joining us today, you are probably the kind of person who really loves cutting through the noise. You want to bypass that overwhelming flood of daily information and just get straight to a thorough, multi-perspective understanding of things that actually shape our world.
Absolutely. And today we have a mission that was perfectly tailored for you.
Yeah, we are going to explore the incredible, shape-shifting, honestly, almost viral nature of the Ramayana and the great Indian epics. When I say epic, I really don't want you to picture like one dusty old book sitting on a pedestal in a museum somewhere.
Right. Definitely don't picture that.
We have gathered a massive stack of sources for you today. We're covering ancient Hindu texts, Buddhist Jataka tales, Southeast Asian royal cults, and some truly explosive, politically charged critiques from modern history.
It is a phenomenal stack of materials. And you're right to clarify what we mean by epic. I mean, when we talk about these stories, we often default to thinking of a single definitive text. But what our sources today reveal is a vast living narrative ecosystem.
A living ecosystem, yeah.
Exactly. These stories are alive. They are constantly adapting to the geographic, political, and spiritual needs of the people telling them. By looking at these diverse sources, we get to see not just the story itself, but how human societies use mythology to understand their own world, how they use it to justify their power, and crucially, how they use it to rebel against oppression.
Exactly. And before we really jump in, I want to give you, our listener, a quick heads up about how we are approaching this. The source material we're looking at today contains some highly politically and religiously charged content.
Very charged.
Right. We're going to be exploring orthodox, deeply traditional viewpoints, absolutely. But we are also going to be examining some radical, anti-caste, left-wing critiques of those exact same traditions. So as your guides on this deep dive, we want to make it crystal clear
That we are looking at this strictly as literary and historical explorers.
yes, exactly. We aren't taking sides, and we aren't endorsing any specific viewpoints. Our goal is just to lay out the fascinating ideas contained within these original texts and let you see the sheer spectrum of human thought.
And trust me, it is a wild spectrum.
It really is. By the end of this deep dive, you're going to hear about a version of the Ramayana where absolutely no war takes place. You'll hear about a Thai king who used the epic as a kind of Trojan horse to teach Buddhist philosophy. And we'll dig into a scathing historical critique that completely flips the script, framing the epic's beloved heroes as villains and its traditional villains as profound scholars.
That spectrum is really the heart of today's discussion. It forces us to ask what a story even is once it leaves the hands of its original author and enters the public domain of an entire subcontinent.
Okay, let's unpack this. Let's start right there with the idea of a single definitive text, or, well, rather the complete myth of it. We have an essay in our sources that discusses A.K. Ramanujan's incredibly famous concept of the 300 Ramayanas.
And honestly, even that number is hotly contested.
Right. We have notes here from K. Sachidandan, an expert in the field, who argues that 300 is a massive underestimate. According to him, there aren't hundreds, there are thousands of versions. And it is mind-blowing when you start looking at the immense diversity across these versions.
It really is staggering.
For example, the sources mention the Vali tribal Ramayana. Now, the Vil people have their own rich cultural framework, and in their version of the story, there is no epic battle at the end.
Which is an incredible structural pivot when you think about it. The climax of the traditional epic is this cataclysmic war between Rama and Ravana.
Right. But in the Vilya version, there is no war because the specific culture telling the story just doesn't glorify that kind of violence. Instead, Ravana simply realizes he made a mistake. He repents, he returns Sita to Rama, and they arrive at a peaceful compromise. It's an epic without the epic battle.
What's fascinating here is how this diversity perfectly illustrates the sociological function of oral traditions. A story like the Ramayana is not just a static sequence of events being mindlessly copied from generation to generation, like a monk illuminating a manuscript.
Yeah, it's not a photocopy.
Exactly. It is a living, breathing tradition. When a community adopts the story, they mold it to fit their geography, their religious beliefs, and their core values. The Bil tribe, valuing peace and communal harmony, naturally shapes a peaceful resolution. They literally rewrite the climax of one of the world's most famous stories to reflect how they believe conflict should be resolved.
And they aren't the only ones who fundamentally alter the mechanics of the story based on their beliefs. Take the Jain Ramayana, which is known as the Palmacharya. In this tradition, Jainism's highest tenet is ahimsa, or total nonviolence. So you have a major theological problem.
Right. How can your divine hero, Rama, commit murder?
Exactly. Even if it's the murder of a demon king, the answer is he can't. In the Jain version, Rama is so strictly nonviolent that he absolutely refuses to kill. So the narrative mechanics have to shift to accommodate that moral framework. It actually falls to his brother, Lakshmana, to be the one who kills Ravana. Rama's hands remain completely clean.
It reflects how people make meaning. You cannot have a hero who violates the fundamental moral code of your society. If your society believes killing is the ultimate sin, your hero cannot be a killer. The story has to bend to the theology, not the other way around.
And sometimes the story just bends toward absolute chaotic entertainment.
Oh, definitely.
The sources mention a Malayalam version called the Patala Ramayana. In this one, Ravana is losing the war, so he gets reinforcements. But not just any reinforcements. He gets help from a netherworld Ravana. It's like a mythological Marvel multiverse. You think one 10-headed demon king is bad. Here comes netherworld Ravana as backup.
It is brilliant. And it shows that these narrators weren't just theologians, they were entertainers. They understood how to raise the stakes, how to thrill an audience. But this massive fluidity, this constant shifting of the narrative, creates some incredibly intense modern debates.
Right, because everyone wants to know the real story.
Exactly. When you have thousands of versions, people naturally want to know which one is the real one, which one is the original.
Which brings us to a really interesting source in our stack. It's actually a thread from a Hinduism Stack Exchange forum. Now imagine you're on a forum today, scrolling through debates, and you come across a user asking a very specific, historically grounded question.
Which is older, the Hindu Valmiki Ramayana or the Buddhist Dasaratha Jataka.
Yes. Now the user points out something wild. In the Buddhist Jataka version, Sita is actually portrayed as Rama's half-sister. They are both children of King Dasaratha. The user notes, with some classic internet understatement, that this is very peculiar regarding sibling marriage.
Very peculiar indeed.
Meanwhile, in the Valmiki Ramayana, which is the most widely known Hindu version, Sita is famously found in a plowed furrow by King Janaka. She is a Unija, meaning she is miraculously not born from a human womb.
That Stack Exchange debate perfectly encapsulates the tension between historical scholarship and religious faith. It's a microcosm of a much larger societal argument. You have one user approaching this like an archaeologist, arguing logically that the Valmiki text must be older because Jataka tales were compiled after the historical Buddha, and the sibling marriage detail might reflect ancient tribal practices that were later sanitized.
Right, looking for hard data.
But then the debate shifts entirely into the realm of philosophical epistemology.
Epistemology being the study of how we actually know what we know, right? Like what constitutes proof.
Exactly. How do we prove something is true? Is it through carbon dating? Is it through cross-referencing ancient texts? Well, another user on that forum brings up a completely different framework, the concept of the pramanas.
The pramana.
Yes. In certain schools of Hindu philosophy, pramanas are the acceptable means of acquiring knowledge. You have direct perception, you have inference, and so on. But this specific user relies heavily on one called sabda.
Sabda, which essentially translates to verbal testimony, doesn't it? Like taking someone's word for it.
Yes, but it's not just taking your neighbor's word for it. In this context, sabda specifically refers to the verbal testimony of a trustworthy, enlightened saint or a divine source. For a devout believer operating within this framework, the spiritual insight of an enlightened being is a more accurate historical record than anything a modern historian could dig up.
And this is where the forum thread gets fascinating. To prove the literal historical truth of the Valmiki Ramayana, the user cites Sabda by referencing a conversation involving the famous 19th and 20th century Indian saint Shirdi Sai Baba.
This is a wild story.
It is. According to the source material provided, a devotee once asked Shirdi Sai Baba if the legendary bridge built by monkeys to reach Lanka was actually real. And Sai Baba, according to the text, claimed that he was literally present.
Present for the building of the bridge.
Exactly. He stated that he had lived through many generations, across different eras, and had seen the monkey army with his own eyes. He described them vividly, saying they were clinging to the trees like myriads of ants. For the user on that forum, this testimony, this sabda from a revered saint, completely overrides any modern historical timeline or textual analysis.
It's a profound clash of paradigms. If we connect this to the bigger picture, it raises an incredibly important question about cultural comprehension and how we define truth. What happens when a modern society, perhaps one focused heavily on singular historical facts, tries to force a single monolithic version onto a deeply fluid oral and spiritual tradition?
Right. What happens when you tell the Bill tribe or the Jains or the believers in the Jataka tales, hey, your story is historically inaccurate. Here's the one true version.
Satchidanandan, in his analysis of the 300 Ramayanas, addresses exactly this. He argues that silencing these parallel epics, the tribal versions, the Jain versions, the regional folk songs, is not just an academic loss. It's not just a pity for literature professors. He views it as a direct threat to the democratic imagination itself.
The democratic imagination. That's a powerful phrase. What does he mean by that?
He means the fundamental ability of a society to hold multiple truths, multiple perspectives simultaneously. When you insist there is only one valid truth, one valid telling of a myth, you are essentially marginalizing the cultures, the geographies, and the worldviews of the people who tell it differently. You are flattening a complex, diverse society into a single, easily controlled narrative. Storytelling becomes an act of homogenization rather than an expression of diversity.
That is a profound point to sit with. And I think it perfectly sets up our next massive pivot in this deep dive. Because if the story itself changes so drastically based on who tells it, it naturally follows that the characters within the story, the heroes and the villains, are going to be viewed through entirely different, sometimes completely contradictory lenses. So let's look at the main hero, Rama.
This is where the multiple perspectives really clash in spectacular fashion.
Exactly. Let's start with the baseline. In the traditional Hindu view, which is the most widely known and revered globally, Rama is the divine incarnation, an avatar of the god Vishnu. He descends to Earth with a very specific cosmic purpose.
To restore cosmic order.
Yes, to uphold Dharma, which is duty, righteousness, and moral law, and to defeat the demonic forces of Ravana. In this view, Rama is the ultimate exemplar. He's the perfect son, the perfect king, the embodiment of virtue and sacrifice. That is the traditional Rama.
But our stack of sources introduces a completely different paradigm.
It does. Our sources include a radical, absolutely blistering critique from the 20th century social reformer E.V. Ramaswamy, who is commonly known as Periyar. Now, for you listening, Periyar was a towering figure in the Dravidian movement in South India, a fierce critic of the caste system, and a rationalist.
And again, reminding you of our role here.
Yes, we are impartially reporting the contents of these texts. We are looking at Periyar's critique as a piece of historical and literary analysis. Periyar conducts a searing textual analysis of Valmiki's Ramayana. He strips away all the layers of divinity and theology, and he looks at the text strictly as a secular, historical, and political document. And the Rama he describes as, well, it's very different.
Indeed. Periyar's analysis is a classic textbook example of reading a text against the grain. He isn't making things up out of thin air. He's focusing intensely on specific details in the Valmiki text that traditional devotional interpretations often gloss over, allegorize, or spiritualize.
Let's give some examples, because the details in Periyar's critique are shocking if you're only familiar with the traditional narrative. Let's look at the very origin of Rama's birth.
And the yoga.
Right. Traditional accounts focus on the grand divine yagam, a holy fire sacrifice performed by King Dasaratha to finally beget children. It's usually depicted as a pristine, deeply spiritual ritual. Periyar, reading the text with a brutally literal eye, points out that this yagam wasn't just chanting and incense. According to his reading of the text, it involved massive animal slaughter, heavy meat eating, and intense intoxication.
He highlights the visceral, ancient realities of Vedic sacrifices, which modern interpretations often sanitize.
And he goes further. Citing his translations of the text, Periyar highlights a deeply controversial interpretation regarding Dasaratha himself. The text notes that Dasaratha had 60,000 wives, which is an epic number in itself, and that he was aging and infirm.
So Periyar makes a deduction here.
A huge one. Periyar argues, based on his reading of the rituals described, that the aging king handed his royal wives over to the officiating priests. Periyar makes the scandalous claim that it was actually the priests who impregnated the queens, not the king, stripping away the miraculous nature of the divine birth entirely.
It is a deliberate demystification. Periyar is attempting to pull the epic out of the heavens and drag it down into the messy, deeply human mud of ancient dynastic politics.
And Periyar certainly doesn't stop at Rama's birth. He goes after Rama's character, portraying him as hypocritical and politically manipulative. For instance, the traditional story hinges on Rama graciously accepting exile so his father can fulfill a promise to his stepmother, Kaikeyi, making her son Bharatha the king.
Rama is praised for his selfless obedience there.
Right, but Periyar argues that Rama was fully aware that the throne rightfully belonged to his brother Bharatha all along, due to a promise Dasaratha made to Kaikeyi's family years prior when he married her. Yet Periyar argues Rama secretly plotted with his father to hurriedly usurp the throne and be crowned while Bharatha was conveniently away from the capital.
Periyar frames Rama not as a selfless saint, but as a cunning prince trying to secure a power grab, and he applies the same cynical lens to Rama's actions on the battlefield.
Right, the killing of the monkey king Vali is a prime example. In the epic, Rama needs the monkey army to find Sita. To get it, he helps Sugriva overthrow his brother, the insanely powerful King Vali. But how does Rama kill Vali?
He shoots him from hiding.
Exactly. Periyar highlights the fact that Rama shot Vali covertly, hiding from behind a tree, while Vali was engaged in single combat with Sugriva. Periyar argues this is a cowardly act, claiming Rama shot him in the back because he simply wouldn't dare fight the powerful Vali face-to-face in an honorable duel.
Now, traditionally, theologians have spent centuries debating the Vali Vad, the killing of Vali, offering complex justifications regarding karma, alliances, and divine will. But Periyar refuses to engage with the theology. He simply looks at the action, a warrior shooting an opponent from hiding, and calls it a violation of basic martial ethics.
But perhaps the most damning point in Periyar's critique, and the one that connects most directly to his real-world social activism, is the story of Shambuka from the Uttarakhanda, the final chapter of the Ramayana.
This is a very heavy part of the text.
It is. According to the text, a Brahmin's son dies prematurely in Rama's supposedly perfect kingdom. The sages tell Rama this happened because a grave sin is being committed in his realm. Rama searches the kingdom and finds Shambuka. Shambuka is a Sudra, a member of the lowest caste, which Periyar strongly associates with the indigenous Dravidian people. What is Shambuka's crime? He is performing a severe ascetic penance, a spiritual practice that, according to the strict social codes of the time, was absolutely forbidden to his lower caste. Rama's response: he immediately executes Shambuka.
And the moment Shambuka's head falls, the text says the gods rejoice and the Brahmin's son is brought back to life.
Exactly. Periyar uses this deeply disturbing story to frame the entire epic not as a tale of good versus evil, but as a tool of deep systemic casteist oppression. He argues Rama isn't upholding universal justice. He is violently enforcing a brutal caste hierarchy where a lower caste man is murdered simply for trying to be spiritual.
What's fascinating here is how the exact same text, the Valmiki Ramayana, can be read in two diametrically opposed ways, depending entirely on the social location and the intent of the reader.
Totally different worlds.
Right. For the Orthodox believer, it is the ultimate spiritual guide to virtuous living. Every action of Rama, even the confusing ones like hiding behind a tree or executing a Sudra, is ultimately justified by a higher divine purpose, a cosmic law that humans might not fully understand. But for a social reformer like Periyar, who dedicated his life to critiquing the caste system and what he termed Brahminical hegemony, the text reads as a literal confession of Aryan supremacy and deceit. He strips away the aura of divinity to expose what he sees as raw, oppressive, human political motivations.
It's an incredible teardown. And to really hammer home his point that Rama isn't this flawless, pure divine being, Periyar's critique even digs into the bizarre mythological origins of why Vishnu had to be born as a human named Rama in the first place. You'd think it's to kill Ravana, right?
That's the usual assumption.
But the sources mention these incredible backstories. In one myth, Vishnu was actually cursed by a sage to lose his own wife in a future life, because Vishnu had previously killed that sage's wife. In another myth, Vishnu was cursed because he used a disguise to seduce the wife of a demon named Jalandrasura. Periyar uses these mythological prequels, if you will, to argue that the gods of the epics aren't pure. They are driven by very flawed, very human passions like lust, deceit, and violence.
It's a compelling rhetorical strategy. By focusing on the messy Pikeal myths, Periyar attempts to taint the purity of the main narrative. And this dichotomy of Rama's character, is he a divine savior or an oppressive politician, naturally leads us to look at the equally polarized depictions of his wife, Sita. Because historically speaking, how a society views its heroes inevitably shapes how it views its heroines. The ideal man requires an ideal woman to validate his status.
Absolutely. So let's look at Sita. Her traditional character arc is incredibly famous. It's deeply ingrained in the cultural memory of billions of people. She is the flawlessly loyal wife. When Rama is unfairly exiled to the forest for 14 years, she doesn't stay in the palace. She willingly, stubbornly follows her husband into the harsh, dangerous wilderness.
She insists on it.
She does. She is tragically kidnapped by the demon king Ravana and held captive in Lanka. There, she fiercely resists her captor's advances, remaining utterly devoted to Rama. And ultimately, upon her rescue, her virtue is questioned, and she willingly undergoes a trial by fire, the Agni Pariksha, stepping into the flames to prove her absolute purity and chastity to the world. That is the baseline. That is the Sita of devotion.
She is positioned as the ultimate symbol of Pativrata Dharma, the duty and unwavering loyalty of a wife to her husband, regardless of the hardships he subjects her to.
But our sources introduce us to a completely different angle. The Telugu women's oral Ramayana. This is a folk tradition sung by women, and it shifts the entire perspective of the epic. In these songs, Sita isn't just a supporting character or a symbol of purity, she is the main character. The narrative lens is entirely female. The grand battles with demons, the political intrigues in the Monkey Kingdom, those take a massive back seat. Instead, the focus is on her lived experience as a woman.
Which fundamentally changes the emotional texture of the story.
Completely. The songs focus on the physical pain of her childbirth. Think about that pivot. We go from golden bows and magical arrows to the sheer, terrifying isolation of a woman giving birth alone in a forest. The songs detail her exhaustion, the practical realities of survival, and crucially, they explore her complex emotional attitude toward the men in her life.
They don't just show her being silent and obedient.
Not at all. They explore her anger and her sorrow toward Rama and Lakshmana, the men who repeatedly abandoned her when she needed them most.
This is a powerful, elegant example of textual subversion. By simply shifting the point of view from the battlefield to the domestic sphere, the patriarchal framework of the original text is completely dismantled. It gives a voice to the silenced. The women singing these songs are essentially saying, the men can have their war stories, we are going to sing about what this war cost the women.
And we see this desire to give voice to the silenced continuing in modern feminist rewritings, which our sources also cover heavily. In Malayalam literature, writers like Sarah Joseph have dedicated themselves to telling stories from the perspective of the minor or marginalized women in the epic, the women who are usually just footnotes.
Right, pulling them out of the background.
Exactly. And playwrights like C.N. Srathan Nair do something similar. He takes a character like Urmila, who is Lakshmana's wife. Now, in the main epic, Lakshmana leaves Urmila behind in the palace for 14 years while he goes to the forest to serve Rama. Urmila barely gets a mention, but Nair elevates her, transforming her into a powerful, articulate figure who directly, fiercely questions the ethics of Rama abandoning Sita and the ethics of a system that treats women as disposable background characters.
It's a process of reclaiming the narrative, but then as we look at our sources, we swing back to Periyar, and his approach to Sita is entirely different from the feminist reclamations.
It is a total 180. Periyar has a highly critical, almost adversarial view of Sita. Remember, Periyar is reading the epic with the explicit goal of deconstructing its revered figures to break what he sees as their ideological hold over the populace. He doesn't see Sita as a feminist icon or a tragic victim. He argues that the text actually portrays her as vain, demanding, and deeply flawed.
He essentially reads her character as a manifestation of aristocratic entitlement.
Exactly. He points out that when she was supposed to be adopting the life of a humble forest ascetic, she insisted on taking her fine clothes and jewelry with her. But Periyar goes further, highlighting some genuinely uncomfortable moments in the text. For instance, the crucial scene where Rama is hunting the magical golden deer. Sita hears a cry for help that sounds like Rama. She begs Lakshmana to go help him. Lakshmana hesitates, knowing his duty is to protect her.
And this is where it gets tense.
Very. According to Periyar's reading, Sita doesn't just plead, she verbally abuses Lakshmana. She shockingly accuses him of secretly wanting Rama dead so that he can seduce her and claim her for himself.
It's a moment of intense psychological ugliness in the epic that is very rarely highlighted in popular retellings. It shatters the image of the serene, perfectly composed goddess.
And Periyar doesn't stop there. He argues that when Ravana first arrives at her hermitage in disguise as a holy man, Sita doesn't just offer him basic hospitality, she willingly entertains him. The sources mention that Periyar points out how she describes her youthful, physical form to him. And in a bizarrely specific critique, he argues she deliberately hid her true age from Ravana, calculating that based on the timeline of her exile and marriage, she was actually much older than she claimed to be.
Periyar's reading of Sita is undeniably provocative, and honestly, to many, it's deeply offensive. But analytically, it forces you, the listener, to confront the shadows of the text. Whether one agrees with his harsh interpretation or sees it as an unfair misreading, it highlights the deeply uncomfortable elements of the epic that are often smoothed over to make the story palatable.
Right. And speaking of uncomfortable elements, The source material explicitly discusses the ending of the Valmiki Ramayana. This is the part of the story that always leaves people conflicted. After the war, after the rescue, after the trial by fire where Sita proves her purity,
Rama ultimately abandons her.
he does. He exiles a pregnant Sita deep into the forest. And why does he do it? The text is clear. He does it not because he doubts her purity himself, but because he fears public scandal. He hears the whispers of his citizens, the gossip of the commoners regarding her chastity after living in another man's custody for so long.
He sacrifices his wife on the altar of public opinion and statecraft.
Exactly. And that ancient narrative, the obsession with female purity, the absolute terror of public perception, and the chilling expendability of women for the sake of a man's political reputation, these are themes that are not just ancient history, they continue to resonate deeply and painfully in modern society.
It's a sobering thought. If Rama, the ideal king, and Sita, the ideal wife, are subjected to such intense, polarizing, critical reevaluation,
Right.
what happens when we turn our lens to the ultimate antagonist? What happens when we look at the monster?
Here's where it gets really interesting. Let's flip the script entirely on Ravana. In the dominant popular tradition, Ravana is the 10-headed demon king of Lanka. He is the embodiment of evil, unchecked ego, lust, and cosmic disruption. He is the villain you boo at. He's the effigy that is literally burned every year during the festival of Dussehra. But the alternative traditions we are looking at today paint an entirely different picture. We mentioned earlier K. Sachidandan's poem, Junki Poru. In this modern literary reimagining, the ending is completely wild. Ravana actually gains salvation and goes to heaven.
Which, as you noted, is quite a shock for the guy whose effigy is burned annually.
Right. I mean, wait, Ravana in heaven? How does the poet justify putting the ultimate villain in heaven while Rama is down on earth being critiqued? Well, in the poem From Heaven, Ravana invites Sita to leave Rama and join him. He makes his case. He argues he is a great singer, an unmatched lover, and ethically, he claims he is far superior to Rama.
He brings up the environment too, right?
Yes, he criticizes Rama as a man who wantonly destroyed the natural environment of Lanka through warfare, and ultimately, as a coward who abandoned his own pregnant wife to the gossip of the masses.
This reimagining of Ravana isn't just a modern, edgy literary invention. It actually draws on very old alternative currents within the broader Indian tradition. Periyar, in his massive critique, compiles an astonishing list of Ravana's virtues, and crucially, he draws these virtues directly from the traditional epics themselves.
This is what makes Periyar's critique so hard to ignore. He's using their own book against them. He points out that Ravana wasn't just a roaring monster. He was a great scholar. He was a recognized master of the Vedas and complex scriptures. He was a merciful protector of his own people in Lanka, who thrived under his rule. And he was a pious, unwavering, legendary devotee of Lord Shiva. According to Periyar's reading, Ravana wasn't driven by blind, animalistic lust when he kidnapped Sita. Periyar frames it as a calculated, albeit extreme, act of political retaliation.
Retaliation for what, specifically?
For the brutal, unprovoked mutilation of his sister, Surpanaka. In the text, Surpanaka approaches Rama and Lakshmana, expressing her desire for them. In response, Lakshmana mocks her and physically mutilates her, cutting off her nose and ears. Periyar argues that Ravana, as a king and a brother, kidnapped Sita not to violate her, but to avenge the horrific dishonor inflicted upon his family by these two arrogant princes.
It shifts the narrative from a simple tale of good versus evil to a complex geopolitical conflict between rival royal houses where both sides commit atrocities.
And there is a crucial, incredibly specific detail in the text that Periyar leverages to essentially exonerate Ravana of the worst accusations. According to the mythology, Ravana carried a terrible curse. He was cursed by a heavenly being so that if he ever touched a woman without her explicit, willing consent, his head would instantly shatter into 1,000 pieces and his body would burn to ash.
Ah, the logic trap.
It's exactly. Periyar sets the trap using the text's own internal logic. Because Ravana obviously survived, carrying Sita all the way to Lanka and living in the same compound with her for months, Periyar argues a shocking conclusion. He says there are only two logical possibilities. Either Sita must have gone with him willingly, rendering the kidnapping a mutual elopement, or at the very, very least, Ravana was a perfect gentleman who was highly respectful of her physical boundaries during her entire captivity in Lanka.
It is a brilliant, highly controversial, rhetorical use of the text against its traditional interpretation. What we are discussing here fundamentally is the sociological mechanism of othering. There is an old saying that history is written by the victors. In the context of the epics, historians and secular scholars often argue that the victorious cultures the spreading agrarian societies, turned their rival kings, the indigenous populations, and the forest dwellers into literal monsters and demons. They labeled them Rakshasas to justify their conquest, their subjugation, and the clearing of their forests.
To illustrate how even the traditional text sometimes slips and reveals Ravana's grandeur beneath the demon label, the source is, quote, a moment from Hanuman himself. Now, Hanuman is Rama's greatest devotee. When Hanuman infiltrates Ravana's palace in Lanka at night to find Sita, he looks at the sleeping Ravana. And Hanuman, the loyal servant of the hero, notes that Ravana looked like a full moon among stars.
That's high praise.
Very high. He observed that Ravana was surrounded by beautiful women who were there of their own free will, deeply enamored by his massive intellect, his power, and his physical beauty. The text itself admits his magnetism.
And this deep respect for Ravana, this acknowledgement of his intellectual weight, isn't isolated to Periyar or modern poems. The sources mention the Bengali Lankavathara Sutra. In this deeply philosophical text, Ravana is not portrayed as a demon at all. Instead, he is depicted as a powerful Dravidian king and a profound, seeking Buddhist philosopher. He is shown discussing complex metaphysics and the nature of reality on a level comparable to a Plato or an Aristotle in the Western tradition.
Which is an incredible conceptual bridge, because this alternate view of Ravana, not as a roaring demon, but as a meditating philosopher, naturally leads us into our next massive topic. It shows us how entirely different religions, specifically Buddhism, didn't just reject the Ramayana, they adopted it, hollowed it out, and adapted the entire epic to serve their own spiritual paradigms.
Let's take that geographical journey, because the Ramayana isn't just an Indian Hindu epic. It is a massive foundational Southeast Asian tradition.
It truly is. Our sources detail the Laotian version of the epic, which is known as the Phra Lok Phra Lam. In this version, the story isn't just a myth passed down by bards. It's considered a sacred sermon preached by the historical Buddha himself during his lifetime. The characters we know so well are completely recast within a Buddhist cosmic framework of karma and rebirth. Ravana is revealed to be a previous earthly incarnation of a figure named Devadatta. Now, Devadatta was the Buddha's extremely jealous archenemy cousin who constantly tried to kill him. Or sometimes Ravana is identified as Mara, the cosmic embodiment of desire, illusion, and death. And Rama. In the Laotian version, Rama is a previous incarnation of the Buddha himself.
If we connect this to the bigger picture, we see a textbook. Fascinating example of religious syncretism. Syncretism is the blending of different religious or cultural beliefs into a new, harmonious whole. The question is, how does a non-theistic religion like Buddhism appropriate the massive, action-packed narrative vehicle of a theistic religion like Hinduism and use it to teach its own core values? In the Laotian text, you see the answer. The epic battles with demons aren't about restoring a Hindu cosmic order or upholding the caste system. They are profound allegories for the Buddha's continuous, grueling karmic struggle against base desire and ignorance across multiple lifetimes. The familiar, wildly popular story becomes a brilliantly effective delivery mechanism for Buddhist teachings on equanimity, the cycle of karma, and the necessity of non-attachment.
And we see this even more explicitly and politically in Thailand. The Thai version of the epic is called the Ramayana. It was reconstructed and formalized by King Rama I in the late 18th century. Now, if you just read the text on the surface, the Ramayana looks very Hindu. It features the gods Shiva and Vishnu prominently. It has the demons, the monkeys, the whole cast. However, King Rama I did something absolutely extraordinary at the end of his manuscript. He added a personal epilogue. In it, he explicitly warned his audience not to get lost in the fantastical story. He used the specific Buddhist term moha, which means delusion or infatuation. He essentially said, do not be deluded by the flying monkeys and the magical arrows. Enjoy this story, but use it as a tool to remain constantly mindful of anicca.
Anicca being the fundamental Buddhist concept of impermanence, the idea that everything, kingdoms, love, power, life itself, is fleeting and destined to pass away.
Exactly. Think about the psychology of that. You have a king who spends massive resources compiling this wildly entertaining blockbuster of an epic, full of romance and warfare. And then at the very end, he pulls the rug out from under the audience and says, don't get attached to the fun stuff. Remember, everyone in this story is dead. Everything fades. Remember your own mortality.
That epilogue is absolutely crucial for historians. It proves that the author, a devout Buddhist king, was entirely self-aware. He was consciously, deliberately using a highly popular Hindu narrative framework to impart a distinctly Buddhist philosophical lesson. But we also have to recognize that the Ramayana wasn't just a pious literary exercise in a vacuum, it was the foundational text of a massive, ongoing dynastic cult.
Yes, the statecraft aspect of this is incredible. King Rama I didn't just write the book and put it in the library. He painted the story onto the fabric of the nation. He commissioned massive, intricate murals of the Ramayana to be painted entirely around the cloisters of the chapel of the Emerald Buddha in Bangkok. Now, the Emerald Buddha is the most sacred Buddhist icon in Thailand. It is the palladium of the kingdom, the symbol of the nation's spiritual and political soul. By painting the Ramayana around it, he seamlessly blended the martial, heroic glory of Rama with the Theravada Buddhist ideals of righteous royal authority. When a citizen or a foreign dignitary looks at those murals, they aren't just looking at art, they're reading a political statement. The reigning Chakri dynasty, which King Rama I founded, is declaring that it embodies the flawless virtues of the epic Rama, and that this earthly power is morally legitimized by the sacred, peaceful presence of the Emerald Buddha.
It leads us to speculate on the sheer, undeniable power of aesthetics in politics. We often think of politics as just laws and economics. But the Chakri dynasty used dance, literature, architecture, and sacred icons to solidify their political legitimacy and unify a nation. It proves that mythology is rarely just a bedtime story. In the hands of a capable ruler, mythology is one of the most powerful tools of statecraft ever devised. The stories a state chooses to elevate, fund, and paint on its walls tell you exactly how that state wishes to be perceived, and crucially, how it intends to govern its people.
And that idea of statecraft, the duty of rulers, and how they govern brings us to our final and perhaps most intensely debated theme today, how these ancient epics directly impact modern polity and governance. This whole debate centers around a deeply complex concept called Raj Dharma, or sometimes Kshatriya Dharma. Essentially, this is the ancient moral and ethical code detailing the obligation of rulers. It's the ancient manual on how to uphold justice, protect the vulnerable, and maintain social order.
To understand how Raj Dharma functions in the Indian psyche, it's really helpful to contrast the two great epics, the Ramayana and the Mahabharata.
Let's do that, because they offer very different models of leadership. The Ramayana, generally speaking, portrays a unified, somewhat rigid and idealized moral universe. Rama represents an uncompromising form of Raj Dharma. He consistently, almost ruthlessly, prioritizes state stability and the demands of public office over his own personal emotions, his happiness, and his relationships. That is the ultimate justification given for his banishment of Sita. The state must appear pure, even if the king's heart is broken.
It's an ethic of absolute duty. The Mahabharata, on the other hand, is a completely different beast. It is much messier, much more ambiguous, and highly contextual.
It really is. In the Mahabharata, you have characters like Yudhishthira, the supposedly righteous king, constantly facing what's called Dharma Sankata. These are paralyzing moral dilemmas where every possible choice seems flawed, where doing the right thing in one context is a sin in another. And then you have Krishna, the divine guide in the Mahabharata, who advocates for a highly flexible, incredibly pragmatic form of statecraft. Krishna argues that the ends, restoring ultimate justice, often justify morally questionable means, like lying on the battlefield or attacking an unarmed foe.
So you have these two massive ancient blueprints for how a society should be run. One emphasizes rigid duty and social order. The other emphasizes pragmatism and navigating moral gray areas. But the pressing question for the 20th century became, how do these ancient concepts hold up against the scrutiny of modern egalitarian democratic ideals?
And this is where we bring in a titan of modern history, Dr. B.R. Ambedkar. For those who might not know, Dr. Ambedkar was a brilliant scholar, the chief architect of the modern Indian Constitution, a tireless champion for the historically oppressed Dalit community, and a fierce, unapologetic critic of Orthodox Hinduism. Our sources focus on his explosive text, Riddles in Hinduism. And once again, maintaining our strict impartiality as guides, we are looking at Ambedkar's devastating structural critique as a piece of political philosophy. Ambedkar isn't just nitpicking a few myths or complaining about a specific character. He is systematically attacking the philosophical and social foundation of the religion itself.
Ambedkar's approach is relentlessly rigorous. He wants to dismantle the idea that ancient India was a flawless spiritual utopia. He starts by highlighting what he perceives as a profound lack of morality in the most foundational texts of all, the Vedas.
Right. For example, he points to a specific dialogue in the Rig Veda between Yama and Yami. These are ancient deities, and the dialogue features a sister actively trying to seduce her brother. Ambedkar uses this to argue against the idea that the ancient texts are inherently spiritually elevated or perfect moral guides. He also tackles the popular modern Hindu emphasis on ahimsa, or nonviolence, and vegetarianism. Ambedkar points to ancient texts arguing that the ancient Aryans, far from being the pious, nonviolent ascetics imagined by modern orthodoxy, were actually heavily involved in gambling and were habitual beef eaters. He uses historical textual evidence to argue that modern orthodoxy has essentially sanitized its own past.
But his sharpest, most passionate critique is reserved for the social structure justified by these texts.
Absolutely. His primary target is the Varna Vyavastha, the caste system. He meticulously dissects the ancient legal codes, particularly the famous laws of Manu. He focuses on Manu's highly illogical explanations for the existence of so-called mixed castes. Ambedkar argues that Manu didn't just observe biology, he manipulated it for power. Ambedkar claims Manu simply labeled entire independent indigenous tribes as bastardized offspring of forbidden mixed Varna unions. Why? Simply to strip them of their independence and force them into a severely degraded status at the bottom of the Brahminical hierarchy.
He views the ancient laws not as divine ordinance, but as a calculated system of social engineering designed to maintain the supremacy of a specific elite.
He goes so far as to analyze the very concept of time in Hindu mythology. You often hear about the Kali Yuga, the current mythological age we supposedly live in, characterized by darkness, moral decline, and chaos. Ambedkar makes a radical argument here. He says the Kali Yuga wasn't a divine prophecy, it was a political invention. He argues it was invented by Brahmins merely as a psychological tool to instill existential fear and maintain strict social control over the lower castes, convincing them that any attempt to rise up or demand equality was a symptom of cosmic decay.
Ambedkar's critique is absolutely essential for understanding the evolution of Rajdharma in the modern era. As he was drafting the Constitution, he recognized a fundamental, almost insurmountable problem. Think about it. How do you govern a modern, diverse, democratic society? A society that promises equality to every citizen, using ancient texts that carry so much historical baggage of inequality, hierarchy, and systemic oppression?
You can't. Not according to Ambedkar. His ultimate solution was radical and necessary. He believed India had to completely sever its political theory from its theological past. It had to replace the ancient scripture-based Rajdharma with an entirely new secular and equitable framework. He called this constitutional morality. It was a governing ethos based entirely on the modern Enlightenment principles of liberty, equality, fraternity, and justice. The Constitution, not the epic, would be the new guide for the king, or rather, the prime minister.
And that profound tension, the clash between the ingrained cultural power of the ancient epics and the fragile new promises of modern governance, was deeply felt by other founding figures as well, wasn't it?
It was. Our sources note a really poignant anecdote involving Jawaharlal Nehru, India's first prime minister. Nehru, who was heavily involved in building this new secular state, expressed deep anxiety over how these ancient epics were still being perceived and utilized by marginalized communities. He recounted a specific incident where he witnessed tribal people in the state of Orissa staging a local play. The play was based on a story from the Mahabharata, the story of Ekaliva.
That is one of the most heartbreaking stories in the epic tradition.
It truly is. Ekaliva was a brilliant archer, a young boy from a marginalized forest tribe. He wanted to learn from Drona, the royal Brahmin teacher who taught the princes. Drona refused him because of his low caste. So Ekaliva taught himself, practicing in front of a clay statue of Drona, and eventually became a greater archer than Arjuna, the royal prince. When Drona discovered this, he demanded Guru Dakshina, a teacher's fee. Knowing Ekaliva considered him his guru, Drona demanded Ekaliva's right thumb. Ekaliva, out of pure devotion, cut it off, permanently destroying his ability to shoot, and thereby ensuring the high-caste prince Arjuna would have no rivals.
It's a story that is traditionally taught to emphasize absolute obedience and devotion to a teacher.
Right. But when Nehru watched these tribal people acting it out, he realized something profound. He saw that the tribal people weren't staging this as a religious celebration of devotion. They were performing it as a tragedy. They were using the ancient myth to actively protest their ongoing historical oppression. The myth wasn't a dead story. It was a living wound. It was a language they were using to critique the modern state that was still failing them.
Exactly. And it is vital to note, as Ambedkar frequently did, that criticizing the morality of these ancient texts is not some modern westernized invention imported by the British. Ambedkar frequently pointed to the Charvakas. The Charvakas were an ancient indigenous Indian school of materialist philosophy. They fiercely, openly criticized the Vedas, the concept of the afterlife, and the Brahminical social order thousands of years ago. The debate over the morality, the utility, and the truth of these epics is literally as old as the epics themselves.
It's an unbroken chain of debate stretching back millennia. So what does this all mean for you, the listener, navigating the world today? Over the last hour, we've unpacked a truly staggering amount of material. We've looked at how a single, seemingly simple narrative framework, a prince, an exile, a kidnapping, a war, a rescue, can be wildly, unimaginably transformed based on who is holding the pen or singing the song. To the Orthodox believer, it is a divine scripture and an absolute path to spiritual salvation. To radical reformers like Periyar, it is a dangerous weapon of patriarchal and caste-based oppression that must be actively dismantled. To the Telugu women in the villages, and to modern writers like Sarah Joseph, it is a hidden feminist manifesto waiting to be sung from the shadows. To the kings of Laos and Thailand, it is a profound Buddhist meditation on the impermanence of life, and a highly effective tool for solidifying royal political power. And to the architects of modern India, like Ambedkar and Nehru, it is a historical mirror, reflecting the urgent, desperate need for a new, constitutional democracy that protects the marginalized.
It's a dizzying array of perspectives, and I think it leaves us with a profound, perhaps uncomfortable question about how we interact with information and narratives in our own lives today. We heard earlier from Sachidanandan that forcing a single monolithic version of these stories is a direct threat to the democratic imagination. The ancient cultures we've discussed today, even with all their conflicts and hierarchies, seem to possess a remarkable capacity to understand that truth is multifaceted. They understood that there can easily be 300 or even 3,000 different Ramayana reflecting 3,000 different, completely valid cultural realities, and that these versions can coexist in the same broader cultural ecosystem.
Right. They didn't feel the need to cancel the Jain version just because it contradicted the Valmiki version.
Exactly. So, what does that say about our modern digital age? We have more access to information than any humans in history, yet we are constantly fighting on social media, in the news, and in our politics to establish one single, objective, universally agreed upon truth or narrative. We curate our echo chambers to aggressively filter out any version of the story that doesn't align with our preconceived worldview. In our desperate, angry search for absolute certainty in a single narrative monolith, we have to ask ourselves, are we actually less intellectually free and less imaginative than the ancient storytellers who embraced the 300 variations?
That is a phenomenal, challenging thought to mull over as we wrap up today. The desire for a single truth might actually be a symptom of a shrinking imagination. Thank you so much for joining us on this incredibly deep dive. We hope this journey through the thousands of Ramayanas has challenged some of your assumptions, giving you some new philosophical tools, and above all, sparked your curiosity. We strongly encourage you to always question the single stories you've been told, to actively look for the alternative voices in the margins, and to explore these fascinating, complex sources for yourselves. Until next time, keep questioning and keep diving deep.